us master students. So for those who've been to Oñati and for those who hasn't, that's a unique experience, and I wish you can all go through it eventually. So for the topic that convokes us here, I wanted to present how is my research starting and going regarding my PhD position at the University of the Basque Country, since I am an Argentinian criminal lawyer. And for me, it was a bit complicated to attack these kind of topics from my local perspective. So for me, it was quite interesting to navigate the waters of a more distant conflicts such as the Basque conflict. Therefore, let me share my screen. Let me see. I will keep on talking if everything goes okay. Otherwise, please interrupt me. But I think it's handling it well. Let's see. Okay, so I'm not seeing myself. Perhaps I want to see some Itsy, but I can't. Anyway, just open your mic and I'll be ready for it there. Perfect. Okay, so let's start with this. Pretty much what I wanted to say. I want to see the time. Okay, what I wanted to look more specifically is how the Basque Country has treated the transitional moment from the dictatorship, the Franco dictatorship, up to present, including a transition towards democracy. But in a very specific way, I would like to see one specific collective, one social group of the Basque society that is women, and not any women. I would love to observe how women that have been in any way related to political torture or institutional violence in somehow, by direct violence or being familiar with someone that has been a victim of violence, and how this intertwines with the idea of collective memories. Sorry, that CD that thinks that I'm talking to him. Sorry about that. I'm going to put my watch away. So, let me see, there's something there. Perfect. Why was this relevant to me? And I think the conference title relies on the idea of I wanted to share with all of those that are starting doing research in the Basque Country why it was relevant for me. I mean, I'm not from the territory. I just arrived in February after staying 6 months in Oñati. Now I'm living pretty close to it. But why was this actually relevant for an Argentinian lawyer? Well, first of all, I was realizing that there was something about those things that were not said in the society when talking about violence, when talking about politics. There's some kind of silent position among young people, among people in their 50s, in their 60s. And that's something that it's quite different from what we in Latin America are used to. I mean, we have went through a lot of processes that put the voice up for those who were victims, but specifically from the judicial perspective, right? So we got sentences that were convictions for the military crimes that had happened in Argentina, and many other countries in Latin America have the same, went into the same vein. So within this context, I said, why is this relevant? Well, first of all, because there are not many sentences. The transition between Franco's dictatorship up to democracy, it's quite different. Yes, with nuances, of course. So why this was relevant for me, right? Like, I had to ask this question as a researcher. This is the first step that I had to take. Like, why do I care about this? Why I don't do this in my own country? Well, I think this is how it matters to me, because I am a woman, I am politically involved, I am a feminist, and I am a scholar. And in that sense, right, like situating myself as from where I'm starting this research is that I have a judicial background. I used to work at the district attorney's office in Buenos Aires as a lawyer, as a criminal lawyer, and that gives me a perspective to understand how tragic sometimes the judicial system is. And this is quite interesting when you're observing from a sociological perspective towards justice. You see critical aspects of it, of course. And then the idea of shedding light in the women's voices. This is, for me, it is relevant. It is a point of relevance in any research that I stand. And therefore, this idea of coming and going between the relationship between torture and the democratic institutions. For instance, I ran into this case, the picture will show you. When I was doing the research for my master's dissertation 2 years ago, I found out about a case of Irache Sorzabal. She was tortured in 2001 by the police because she was held incommunicated for 5 days, and then she was put up to a judge. And she was tortured up to the point, you can see the marks there in the picture. That's a picture that went a lot of places, like for many newspapers. It was quite open in all the Spanish territory, not just the Basque Country. And she was convicted afterwards because she was arrested for participating in an armed band, ETA. And but the interesting part of it, and I left because it's, of course, it's the cynical way of police related to the judicial power, is that she was convicted for something that she had said and that was obtained from torture, and there's no relationship for the judge regarding that. The police officers that tortured her were acquitted, and that case was dismissed, and she was convicted for her participation. So from that perspective is where I stand to start this research. Therefore, let me see if my keyword works or not. There. So I was asking from which perspective I was going to observe this problem, because of course, I mean, I am a lawyer. Many of the people present here comes from a law background. And at least in my education as a lawyer, many scholars do not talk about addressing these issues from this kind of perspective. So I thought that I needed to broaden up my perspective. And this I have to thank Beatriz Cohen, which I don't know if she's still here in the room, but she actually encouraged me to go to Oñati, saying she's a brilliant sociologist. And she said, you lawyers, you don't know anything about methodology, which is completely right. So, and after trying to connect with the idea of methods and from others' perspectives of how scholars do research, I ran into memory studies. And of course, the idea that memory has also a relationship with gender stereotypes was completely mind-blowing, but also very obvious. But it was like something that you're always trying to think, and it's there in your mind until you read it somewhere, which is what happened to me, and say, oh, yeah, of course, how come I haven't seen that before? So I really like this author, KREI Hamilton. She is currently not working in these topics anymore, but she comes from, she's a historian, and she actually is taking more of a narrative perspective, narratological perspective as a tool of a historian to address memory. So this quote that I found on the idea that how gender relationships are built, they're also affected as when we are producing history, right? When we are producing memory. So if we agree to the idea that gender stereotypes are intertwined between all the relationships of the society, of course, the production of memory cannot be objected from that situation. And it's also a factor relevant for the memory production processes. So, right, this idea that in most societies, gender has a social organization function and it conditions memory, of course. And from this perspective is that I try to stand myself and to think, okay, so we have the process, right? The process of the transition between democracy, 1975 in Spain, up to present. That period of democracy, especially in the Basque Country, had a lot of irregular processes regarding political violence context, but specifically institutional violence. That's meaning police officers bringing people in and let them be incommunicated and applying ill treatments to them with any other kind of context. And that specific case, that specific event, historical event, for me, it's not being part of the history of the collective memory that it has been narrated by the official historian. So I had to go and look alternative ways of producing memory, such as what KREI Hamilton is presenting to us, for instance, and saying, okay, if there are different ways of producing collective memories, that means that there are alternative memories that are a resistance to a very hegemonic memory. Therefore, within taking that into consideration, I will have to ask very much I will have to ask a lot of questions. And since this is a very starting point of my research, I had to start somewhere. So therefore, you will see that this is very broad, very broad. Now it's coming to a more narrowed questions of research, but of course, I had to start somewhere. So if you're doing research from memory studies perspective intertwined to feminist studies, what are the kind of questions you're going to ask? First of all, you need to determine what's a historical event. In my case, I'm trying to determine that the historical event is that the victims of torture, the torture itself, it's something that is not narrated in the same way, that it's not remembered in the same way, that it's not something that people are and have an agreement on. So to identify how are these narratives being contested, you need to understand which are the social groups that create that kind of memory. So are these social groups women that are victims of torture? Who are naming them as victims? Are they naming themselves as victims? How did they understand violence? Do they understand themselves as survivors or victims, or are they just trying to go under the idea that no, what they suffered is not so bad because they were not, I don't know, killed. So perhaps they shouldn't be complaining about it. So this leads me to the idea of how we build collective memories. How is that processes happening? So, and this is my judicial part of the research. Is there any possibility that we can build collective memory from a judicial actor? And easy up that question, many scholars have already answered that question, such as a professor of the master, which is Moshe Hirsch. He says that international actors and national actors, such as tribunals, they can collect from the narratives, the facts, and from those facts, they can establish an hegemonic narrative. But the problem in the Basque Country is that if the historical event is the lack of denounce or the lack of understanding that there was torture, has a relationship with the idea that there are only 20 sentences of conviction in the whole country for torture between 68 up to present. And this is completely without reflection, without any same idea of what the society that is making the denouncings of torture considers that had happened. And why do I have this information? This information is public because the Instituto Vasco de Criminología, the Basque Institute of Criminology, has started doing with the Basque Parliament in 2017 a report that is collecting the information in an administrative way of all those cases of torture that the victims are denouncing. And the number is pretty much close to 6,000 between 68 up to present. Therefore, if you only have 20 sentences of conviction and more than 6,000 cases of torture and ongoing, they're still collecting testimony. Therefore, there is a gap, and that's the gap that I would like to observe, and I would like to understand why is there such a gap, and how women of the Basque Country, women that are victims, are remembering that event. And that remembering is the production of a counter memory, of an alternative memory that it's not the hegemonic. Therefore, from that all being said, all those broad questions that, of course, they will suffer the cut. Pretty much I have two key elements that are intertwined that are going to be part of my research questions, which is the correlation between the judicial processes and the production of collective memories, and the production of collective memories by the Basque women that were tortured between the 75 up to present. Right, so in which ways are these two elements intertwined? Therefore, regarding that, taking into account that we are talking about how is doing research, so this is why I'm focusing myself on all the steps that I'm taking for my research. I'm going to take two broad fields of knowledge that are going to be part of my epistemology, of course, which are feminist studies, with the intention of understanding what are the perfect. I just saw your message with that. What are the voices of the victims in the idea that not just what they're saying, but how they're constructing their reality, and that will be my epistemological base. And also how these intertwine with the idea of reparation, restoration, perhaps from a victimological perspective, or just a restorative justice perspective. And of course, this will rely on the idea that memory studies are giving me the possibility to reinterpret these power relationships that exist among the interpretations of certain narratives of the present or the past. And of course, this allows me to develop the idea that stereotypes are not just located into the justice system, but they're also located in the idea of how social groups are reproducing them in order to accept, to understand a narrative that it's not, that is actually the hegemonic one. Of course, when we're talking about something that is hegemonic, normally it's linked to the idea that it has patriarchal bias, sorry. Pretty much, my keyboard is not working fine. There. So just to sum up a little bit, to talk about the research design, and this is the part that I'm not proud of. It's a working process, but pretty much the idea, it's going between documents analysis with the idea that there are many interviews that already exist at the Basque Institute of Criminology, and trying not to re-victimize those women that were tortured. Luckily I have the access to all those tapes and records and interviews, and of course the judicial sentences in which torture was denounced, but especially in those that was convicted. My idea is to select a few cases but I'm not still sure if I'm going to take an approach of a case study approach or not. Perhaps more narratological experience, I'm not sure. So this part will be incredible to hear comments from the people in the room. And of course, if I can observe that there is some information lacking from the perspective that I wanted to see, which is how do these women produce a common memory, perhaps to adjust a little bit the information by adding a few in-depth interviews with these women, with a few of them. And then, of course, this is another idea, but I think it won't be necessary. The idea of focus group of women that are direct victims or indirect victims. For instance, there's a case that it's very, very well known of a sister of a young man that was tortured. And she's quite militant about it. And she was just last week, Pilar Zavala, she was recognized as a victim herself by this law. So this could be an interesting approach as well. And to conclude on something that it's not up to conclusion, I don't know. I think, and these are my, how you say it, my pre-constructed ideas that I hope I can lose by doing my research is that the process in the Basque Country is completely interject by a lack of inclusion. There are not, all the voices are not included in the process of pacification of the Basque Country. And you can observe that by observing, just living here. And this is something that it's quite amazing for me because you can actually see it. So how can I, from my perspective, as I mentioned, from where I come from, understand this process, and how can I don't know, in a way, contribute to the Basque society to a more inclusive process? I think it's if we take into account that women actually produce memories differentially, that because we're also part of stereotypes social system, then we can perhaps understand a little bit better how to arrive to a more inclusive transition. But this is something that we'll have to see. Let's talk in 3-4 years after the PhD. It's pretty much advanced. And thank you so much for your attention. Eta eskerrik asko.
Thank you so much, Malena, for this amazing presentation. I know that it's the discussant, but I was hearing you, and as you say, no, it seems once that you think about it, it seems very obvious that everything, including collective memory, is gendered, and it doesn't truly put woman in the center, but it's so normalized that you don't really realize it until you are working on it, no? And as you know, the concept of collective memory is truly important in shaping the understanding of the past and how it can impact the present, no? So yeah, if we don't search this with a feminist perspective, we are keeping women in shadows, no? Because again, we as women experiment everything in a different way, including torture. For example, in Venezuela, it has been documented that tortured women face different kinds of torture than men, including sexual violence and other types of aggression, no? And if we don't include this, then a huge part is missing. But now it's time for Itziar to discuss this amazing presentation, and thank you again, Malena, for your words.
Well, Arratsaldeon, hello, buenas tardes. Well, first of all, I agree with Victoria. Thank you, Malena, for your interesting, honest, and well-explained presentation. I already knew about your doctoral research, but I'm very glad that today I could delve deeper into it and into your thinking process too. First, I would like to encourage all the people in our virtual room to participate in this discussion, since this is what makes this meeting more enriching. You can both raise your hands, or you can just write your comments and questions in the chat, and I will read them for you, if that's okay. But if I'm not wrong, since there are no hands raised yet, while you think about your questions and comments, I will share mine first. So first of all, I would like to make a small remark about your research, as Victoria has done. I think that one of the most valuable points of your research could be that you study the construction of a counter memory that directly challenges gender roles, and therefore challenges the very constructed idea of what a woman is, but also challenges the idea of violence against women itself. I mean, on the one hand, it is a counter memory that positions women as political subjects, that and shows that women can be subjects involved in violent context and subjected to repression, physical violence, and torture perpetrated by institutions. But on the other hand, it is a form of institutional violence against women that is very different from the one that we're used to, which is the one that is based on inaction rather than action. So according to what you have explained to us in your research, we could identify three main axes that run through your study: two theoretical ones, feminist studies and memory studies, as you have said, and one that has to do with the more practical context, which could be Euskal Herria women and politics. So I will ask you one question for each of these axes, if that's okay. First of all, concerning feminist studies, and probably as you all already know, within feminism, there is an unresolved debate about how to work with women's voices and experiences. On the one hand, on many occasions, women's voices have been automatically validated as a way of counteracting the masculine, racialized, and Eurocentric narrative that you, as you mentioned, that universalizes the ways to interpret experiences. And on the other hand, many feminist studies have also pointed out that women's experiences are also produced by structural power relations that shape the meanings of events, and therefore women's voices cannot be accepted uncritically. So my question here is, have you thought about these issues related to women's voices or viewpoints? Which disadvantages do you see in considering women's voices as the only truth or a source of truth itself? Secondly, concerning memory studies, these other acts, and of course I'm not an expert in this particular field, but I suspect that the question of epistemic extractivism could be very important here. So my question is, have you thought about epistemic extractivism in relation to that possible interviewees who have suffered torture? I mean, possible, since you said you haven't decided yet if you are going to do these in-depth interviews and focus groups. For example, one idea that could minimize the risk of extractivism could be to seek a dialogue on the participants' terms and with the pretension of a horizontal exchange, if that is completely possible. Another example could be sharing with them the theoretical and research skills that may be useful to the community, or finally, for example, giving the interviewees the opportunity to read and check the full work before its publication, so that they can modify or clarify their statements. These are just some ideas that I throw here. And finally, concerning this more practical context, women in Euskal Herria, my question is, have you already thought of a way of disseminating this counter memory? I mean, as you know, many studies remain normally in the academic sphere. So my question is if you have thought about any strategy to ensure that the work reaches the women of the Basque Country and serves them effectively, politically, or to construct their memory from a more feminist perspective, or to counteract this hegemonic narrative. These are my questions for the moment. Thank you.